It was late in the fall. The weather was rainy, and the wind had blown all the leaves off the trees. I was riding my horse across a wet, empty landscape, all alone. I was on my way to a dark and eerie house, the house of Usher. Why was I going to such a lonely place? Well, I knew Roderick Usher, the owner of the house. We were childhood friends, but we hadn't seen each other in years. A few weeks ago, I got a letter from him. "I'm very sick, seriously sick. Please, come visit me. I feel like I'm losing my mind. I need your help. We've been friends since we were kids. Please, come. Roderick Usher." I had been riding all day, and by the time I arrived at the house of Usher, the sun was already setting, casting a pale light across the land. The house was surrounded by a dark, still lake. I stopped by the water and stared at the building. It was huge, dark, and lifeless, with rows of windows that looked like empty eyes staring back at me. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine, and I felt uneasy, maybe even a little scared. There was a narrow road in front of me, leading to a bridge that crossed the lake and went straight to the house. I guided my horse onto the road and crossed the bridge until I reached the house's walls. When I knocked on the front door, a servant answered. He took my horse to the stable and then led me inside. We climbed a lot of stairs on the way to Roderick's room. The walls were lined with lamps, but they barely lit the place, leaving long corridors and stairways full of shadows. Finally, the servant opened a big wooden door, and I stepped into a large room. At first, I didn't recognize the man lying on the sofa. Then it hit me. It was Roderick Usher. My old friend had changed so much. He looked sick and pale. We were the same age, but he looked way older than me. His hair was silver gray and so fine that it reminded me of a spider's web. At first, I thought he was asleep because his eyes were closed. But as soon as I walked in, he sat up and opened his eyes. In the dim light of the room, his eyes shone in a strange, unsettling way. I walked over to him. "Welcome, my oldest and dearest friend," he said with a weak smile. But he didn't shake my hand or come closer. "I'm sorry," he added quickly. "I don't mean to be rude. I'm just not well. I can't touch anyone right now. Please have a seat and rest for a bit. A servant will show you to your room soon. Then we'll have dinner and catch up." "I'm so glad you're here," he continued. "I've had no one to talk to. My sister lives here with me, but she's very sick." Just then, a woman entered the room. She was pale, and her eyes had a strange shine to them. She was wearing a long black dress with a high collar that covered her neck completely. She didn't look at me or say a word. Roderick turned toward her. "Madeline," he said softly. "Madeline, this is my old friend." She didn't reply. Slowly, she walked across the room, turned, and disappeared through another doorway. She came and left so quietly, it felt almost unreal. Roderick put his hands over his face. "My sister has a very strange illness," he said. "She's never fully awake or fully asleep. I'm afraid she won't live much longer." He rang a bell, and a servant appeared to take me to my room. I lay down on the bed to rest for an hour before dinner. My mind kept wandering to Roderick and his sister, Something about them, and this house, felt off. But I couldn't just leave. Dinner was a bit better. Roderick asked about my life, and for a while, he looked more cheerful. I almost forgot about Madeline and the creepy old house. For the next few days, Roderick took good care of me. We spent our time eating, drinking, and talking. We read books in the library. I painted while Roderick played the guitar. I didn't see Madeline again, and I didn't ask about her. Roderick seemed to enjoy having company after being alone for so long. We talked about happier times, especially when we were kids. But every now and then, Roderick would stop mid-sentence and just stare ahead. Then he'd slowly turn his head, like he was trying to hear something. His face would fill with this mix of sadness and fear, and honestly, those moments made me feel uneasy too. I didn't like the house of Usher. There was something about it that made me uncomfortable. But I'd come all this way for Roderick, and I couldn't just leave. He clearly needed me to stay. As time went on, Roderick became quieter and more withdrawn. One night, he suddenly came into my room. "Madeline is dead," he said. I froze, completely stunned. I didn't know what to say or do. "I need your help," he continued. "She was very ill. I knew she was going to die. But she can't be buried near a church. She'll stay here, in this house. I'll keep her body in a room below the house. Will you help me?" His words sent chills down my spine. But for some reason, I didn't ask any questions. I just agreed. We carried Madeline's body down a long staircase to a room beneath the house. It was cold, damp, and covered in cobwebs that hung like curtains from the ceiling. The air felt heavy and smelled old. There were a few lamps on the walls, but they barely lit the room. In the center of the room was a wooden coffin. Together, we placed Madeline's body inside. She was dressed in a white gown, and her face was as pale as her dress. Roderick stared at his sister for what felt like forever. "Madeline will stay here now," he said, his voice full of sadness. His face was so pale that his skin seemed to stretch thin over his skull. It was clear he hadn't eaten in days. Madeline wasn't breathing, and her heart wasn't beating, but her body wasn't cold either. That's when it hit me, and fear gripped me. She was dead, but at the same time, she wasn't fully gone. Roderick closed the coffin lid and fastened it shut. Then he led me out of the room. "No one will ever come down here again," he said. "Madeline is at rest now. No one will disturb her." But from that moment on, Roderick himself found no rest. He couldn't sleep, not even for a moment. How long can someone survive without sleeping? He wandered aimlessly through the house, going from room to room. His eyes seemed to look right through things, as if he were seeing something no one else could. Sometimes he would tilt his head, first to one side, then the other, like he was trying to hear something. Was he losing his mind? I couldn't sleep either. I lay on my bed, troubled by thoughts of this strange house and the even stranger things happening inside it. Then, suddenly, my bedroom door burst open. Roderick stood there holding a lamp. His eyes were wide and wild, glowing with some kind of manic energy. "Did you hear it?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Did you see it?" "Hear what?" I asked, sitting up. See what? You'll understand soon, he said cryptically. He walked to the window, pulled back the curtains, and threw it open. Outside, the night was pitch black, but a storm was raging. The wind howled and rain poured down. Then a streak of lightning lit up the sky for an instant. A few seconds later, the thunder followed, crashing so loudly it seemed to shake the whole house. The wind rushed into the room, howling like a living thing. It slammed the door shut, and the flame in the lamp flickered out, leaving us in darkness. Suddenly, a deep rumble came from beneath us, and I felt the floor shift. "I can hear the softest sounds," Roderick whispered, his voice shaking. "I can hear everything. I can hear her." "Who?" I shouted, trying to block the wind from my face. "Who do you hear?" "Madeline," he screamed. "She's coming. She's opened her coffin. She's coming up the stairs. She's coming for me." As if on cue, the wind whipped through the room again, forcing the door open with a bang. Outside, lightning lit up the hallway in bursts, and then I saw her. Madeline Usher stood in the doorway. She was wearing the white dress she had been buried in, but it wasn't white anymore. It was stained with blood. She had clawed her way out of the coffin. Her hands and face were covered in cuts, and blood dripped from her fingers and onto her dress. Her eyes were open, but they didn't seem to see anything. She stared straight ahead, her arms stretched out toward her brother. Roderick didn't run. Slowly, he stepped toward her, as though he couldn't resist. Then she wrapped her bloodied arms around him. Roderick let out an ear-piercing scream before collapsing to the floor. Madeline fell with him. They lay there together, motionless. Both of them were dead. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted from the house of Usher, running as fast as I could across the narrow bridge. When I finally made it to the other side of the lake, I turned back to look. The storm was still raging, the wind swirling around the house like a living beast. It howled and roared, and for a moment I could almost see it, a dark, terrible force circling the house. Lightning struck again, brighter and louder than before, and the walls of the house began to crack. Slowly, piece by piece, the house of Usher collapsed into the lake. With a deafening roar, it was swallowed by the water. Then everything fell silent, and the lake was still once more. The house of Usher was gone.